A new study has come out from the Center for Climate Change Economics and Policy in conjunction with the Grantham Research Institute called Stopping Climate Change Almost Impossible If China Cannot Quit Coal. Essentially, the gist of this study is to show how China is the big bad polluter in the world and the one that's causing all the problems that it is that we're facing with climate change. And essentially, although not explicitly, is pretty much pinning everything on China and China alone. The actions China takes in the next decade will be critical for the future of China and the world, the study said. Whether China moves on to an innovative, sustainable, and low-carbon growth path this decade will, more or less, determine both China's longer-term economic prospects in a natural resource-constrained world and the world's prospects of cutting greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently to manage the grave risks of climate change. It's one of those situations where we're not explicitly saying it's all China's fault. We're just saying it's almost impossible if China doesn't do what we want them to do. The fact is, the impact that China actually makes in the world in terms of tonnage of pollution is actually smaller than it's actually made out to be by the media. Now, one particular reason is because it's generally looked at as the overall tonnage, and it says, look how much more China pollutes than the United States. Well, certainly, it has an immensely larger population. However, once we do look at the amount of tonnage per person, we see China really isn't the person who's at fault here. Well, if China really isn't the biggest problem in the world in terms of pollution, then who really is? The fact is, what we're looking at is a game here where there's pollution in the world, and a great problem of it causing this climate change, and the first world continually passes the buck off onto the developing world, or outright third world. That's the thing that keeps happening here. It's always these other countries that are using coal right now that are the problem, not the countries like, say, the United States or the UK. Particularly the UK. They were going through the UK, Germany, the United States. We're going through the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, who've been dumping massive amounts of pollution into the environment since that time. And then in later times, particularly, more specifically, the last 50 to 60 years, with the huge industrialization that has taken place. Not just the UK, the US, the Soviet Union as well, Japan, Germany, even Australia too, have done a great deal here. Now, these studies completely ignore that fact that the great deal of the pollution that's in the world right now, the historical context of it, has been the first world that's been doing that. Yet these attacks seem to be primarily directed towards China, the developing world, and third world countries. We do, however, notice that India really isn't attacked that much. I mean, it has a very large population. It, however, is an ally of the United States and the UK. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. The fact is, a lot of these countries, like China, like India, and others around the world that are still primarily using coal and less green energy, the reason they're still doing this is because of historical underdevelopment, that they are now trying to play catch up to the rest of the world. They don't have the luxury of going through hundreds of years of development like the First World did, or what we now come to know as the First World. They have to do this very quickly in a very short amount of time. China's original policy had been to develop at all costs, meaning to hell with the environment, we have to play catch up right now. It is also very important to note that this large degree of historical backwardness is due largely to the fact that a lot of these countries were held back by imperialism itself, and some of these countries still get held back by imperialism today. I'm not saying that's the case of China, because it most certainly isn't. But some of these countries today are even held back by the acts of imperialist countries. A very important fact in this whole situation is that China has taken a lot of measures to promote more green energy and have done a lot to curb its pollution in the last several years. I mean, China has gone on a major blitz within that, the same amount of time period to cut down on the amount of emissions in the country. Now, a lot of them have not been very successful, largely due to business not actually cooperating and, frankly, a lack of oversight from the government in making these businesses do it. They did, however, just recently announce the fact that they were going to push a path of green energy, more environmentally sustainable energy production, even at the cost of GDP, which means they are actually willing to reduce and even shrink their own economy as long as it gets to a sustainable level to where they're not causing such tremendous harm to the planet. And in the meantime, we see all these first world companies saying that, well, frankly, to hell with it. We're going to do whatever we want. We're going to destroy the planet all we want in order to prop up our own resources. Would you ever see them doing that? Would you see the United States government saying, okay, we're going to sacrifice the GDP in order to be more energy sustainable, or more energy that's less destructive to the environment? No, you wouldn't. Does China have a lot of work to do in terms of getting its economy into a position where it's not so blatantly poisoning the planet? Absolutely. They've got a lot of work to do. They still have to catch up to the rest of the world in terms of that development. The rise of the middle class in China alone is making this an absolute necessity. I've spoken about the rise of the middle class in China before, and what we are beginning to see is that at least China recognizes what kind of damage this is being done to the environment and realizes what impact it's had. I mean, you pretty much can't miss all the photos and videos of the terrible pollution conditions inside of China, and they recognize this and are now on a path to do something about it. So this report comes as China has already announced its intentions to do so. Meanwhile, the first world still continues to drag its feet, refusing to actually do something. This report is a continuation of what we've already seen, where the first world passes the buck off onto the third world. They have to use more green energy. They have to change their more polluting ways, even when we can see that even tonnage per person is completely different. They are not the problem that the first world is. But this is a continuing thing where everybody else is trying to play this game of to catch up to the first world due to historical underdevelopment. Yet the consequences for this and the need to change is always passed off onto those who are trying to do it, and not those who've done it this entire time. And this isn't just from industry itself. This isn't from government. This is also from regular, first world peoples. Genuinely, as we can see from the statistics, first world peoples, particularly Americans, don't care about the damage that's being done. Yet when we look at other countries, there is certainly a greater degree of concern over what's happening. So this faux, somewhat outrage coming from these studies and from first world groups, they're pretty much almost hypocritical, as they themselves, proven by their own populations and their own behaviors, not only just their consumption, but their waste itself, and from their own straight out opinion, don't particularly care that this problem is even going on. The fact is, a lot of these third world countries are pushed into a position by regulations being put down by the IMF, the World Bank, and whatnot, that they have to abide by certain guidelines in development, which they can't afford to do because of their historic underdevelopment. Meanwhile, the first world is left with a free hand to do whatever it wants because, frankly, they have the market power to do so. Thank you for watching. Please comment and rate the video. If you liked it, hit subscribe or check out some of these other great videos. If you wish, share it on social media. While you're at it, why don't you follow me on Twitter? And if you got time, go on over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.